Hi, this is Nick Mason of Pink Floyd, and you're watching Smoke TV.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm the chief photographer for Smoke magazine. I'm here with Nick Mason, the drummer of Pink Floyd. He's a former student at the University of Westminster, which was formerly known as the Regent Street Polytechnic. Let's ask him some questions.
Architecture.
And why did you choose it?
I think partly because I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do, but the great thing with architecture is it's such a good general training. Because I wanted to work in London, and it was really the sort of schools that I'd looked at and looked interesting with the AA, Regent Street Poly, and they offered me a place, so that was it. Yeah, no, architecture is absolutely full of useful information because it's part, it's arts and sciences. So there's a certain amount of structures, a certain amount of painting and so on. Not only do I think we learn quite a lot about useful stuff, but it put us in touch with people who've done the same sort of training. Mark Fisher, Jonathan Park, all the people that did our stage designs were architecturally trained. So were most of our lighting designers. Arthur Max, who is now, he works for Ridley Scott. Yeah, absolutely. Roger Waters and Richard Wright were also in my year, and that's how we met and how the band originally came together. My yearmaster at the time, when I left, was called Joe Mayo, and he was wonderful because what happened was that I'd done 3 years and I've got a certificate, and so I'd done my 4th year in an office and started on my 5th. And I was really worried about stopping because it was impossible to play with the band and hold down and be a student, because I could get my friends to sign me in, but there was a point at which people actually did notice I wasn't there at all. And Joe was fantastic because I went to him and talked about it, and he said, look, what he actually said was take a gap year, but gap years hadn't really been invented. But he said, it's fine, we'll have you back in a year's time. So it was really easy to leave, but also, my parents weren't then worried about it and throw my career away and so on. And what was fantastic was I saw him about 3 years ago because I'd written a book about the band, and I think his daughter had discovered this and that he was mentioned in it. And so he came to Goodwood for one of the car events there, because he was always quite a car enthusiast. And we sat and talked for quite a while. It was a very good moment for me. Well, I was probably more successful as a drummer than I would have been as an architect. And having said that, it was a very interesting period. The other tutors I had, part-time tutors, were Richard Rogers and Norman Foster in particular, and obviously they seem to have made a success of architecture, as far as I can tell. And I have to mention here that the other guy who was a lecturer was a guy called Mike Leonard, and he used to part-time lecture at Poly and part at Hornsey College of Art, and he was absolutely instrumental in the band getting going, because we ended up supplying the music, the soundtrack for Hornsey, when they were doing a light and sound workshop. So if it hadn't been for Mike, I think we probably would never have actually got off the ground. Actually, they were very cool, I have to say, yeah, because as I say, I was halfway through the course anyway, and there's a point of, it's a bit like, what's it a bit like, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? There's a point at which you get the paperwork, and you keep the paperwork whatever happens, so you can actually go on and finish the course further down the line. So they knew that, and also what was happening with the band was sort of interesting, and it was You know, we were getting coverage in the sort of quality newspapers rather than the News of the World. No, it was fantastic. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I think I got all the things that you're sort of meant to get from sort of post-school education, as in you meet lots of interesting people. I ended up meeting the people I then went on to work with for the next 40 years. But there were there were a lot of other people who were actually in and out of the band from the Poly at the time. A couple of whom I'm still in touch with. So it was, no, I mean, it was also, I mean, now when I'm talking about the sort of the early days of the band, I say it was a sort of government-funded initiative because we all had grants. And so when the grant came through, the first thing you did was you bought a couple of books and then went down the Charing Cross Road. And remember, Roger's grant came in and we bought a bass guitar and a carry. There is a student world that is really exciting. It's that point at which you leave home. You leave school, you tend to leave home. And there's an awful lot going on. You know, I remember, I mean, I don't know whether they still have Rag Week, but not. We're talking a long time ago. But so there was a whole sort of student life, and it was a big. I mean, there were 40 of us in that first year, probably more in the first year, and then people dropped out or sort of fell back over a period of time. Not really. Very few, but of course the problem actually is rock and roll is not conducive to maintaining relationships. You know, the problem is so much time you're travelling, so much time you're away, so you're always sort of trying to make arrangements to meet up, and then you never do, and after 3 or 4 of those people get a bit pissed off basically and think, oh, he's being grand, doesn't want to see us anymore, he's hanging out with Elvis. As I say, it had a big impact, but in different ways. I mean, the main thing was the fact that 3 of us met there. But the second thing was that it gave us the opportunity to develop. You know, we used to rehearse in the common room down in the basement. And there were the influences on us, as I say, Mike Leonard in particular. But I think that from my experience of what I've seen since, that whole business of being in a band or playing music, being a student is about the easiest way of doing it, because trying to hold down any sort of regular job and rehearse and actually look for work and so on is really tough, really tough. My favourite piece of music advice was Noel Redding, the bass player with Jimi Hendrix. He said, study law and buy a gun. But I know, I think in this day and age, the biggest problem is that you have to be, the skill set you need is, you need to be a good writer, a good player, but you also need to be an entrepreneur. You need to be able to start thinking about other ways of selling your music, because even if you can get the record deal, that may not be enough. The record companies are not really necessarily the people who can really make the difference in the industry. But it's a big period of transition, I think, at the moment, and I think the more you can do yourself, the easier it'll be. Started when I was 13 or 14, but I didn't take it very seriously, and sadly have failed to take it very seriously ever since.
Have you had any music lessons?
No.
Anything?
Oh yes, I had music lessons in piano and violin, but I've never had any drum lessons. And I would recommend anyone who wants to play the drums to get some lessons. It was almost certainly something at the Poly. It was probably a version, probably contained Roger and myself, and then a bunch of other guys from college at the time, probably for, either for the college or for a friend's party somewhere else. Well, funnily enough, architecture, I suppose, because I've got to. I mean, it'd be far too late to get back to it now. I mean, I'm still interested in building. I still enjoy the whole business of buildings and sort of from the design up and so on. But I could never, at this stage, start operating. I mean, apart from the technology, just the whole business of running a job would be quite beyond me. I love it, but it's a hobby. It's and I would never. In a way, it would spoil it almost to try and turn it into a profession. I'm not good enough to be a professional racer. I'm certainly not brave enough, and I'm now far too old and frightened. Rent cars for films and television primarily. So we're a sort of props company, really, and. Yeah, so people are making a commercial in particular. Commercials were our sort of speciality. But anything that involves particularly a bit of trick driving or racing cars, sort of specialised, slightly specialised in terms of fast cars and fast driving rather than just any Morris Thousands and so on. They will do anything for money. My dad was he was a documentary filmmaker and made films about motor racing in particular, but he also made films about the history of the motor car, about flight. He worked for Shell in the period when all these big companies had their own film units. And so I was brought up in a motoring household. He used to race himself, and so I went to Silverstone when I was a small boy. Yes, I think so. Although it's a bit like asking about favourite children, you don't want to upset the others. But the Ferrari 250 GTO probably, because you can do anything with it. It's a racing car, it has a history of racing, you can rally it, you can drive it on the roads. Both my daughters went to church for their weddings in it, and it makes me look really clever because I bought it I didn't buy it cheaply, it was very expensive, but it's now the value has escalated to the point where people think I'm really clever. The biggest influences by far were the drummers who were playing, were the great drummers from that period. So the late 60s, Ginger Baker in particular, Mitch Mitchell, Keith Moon, Blinky Davison, who was a drummer in a band called The Nice. I don't have a favourite decade, I really don't. I mean, I've liked, from the point of view of what we were doing, I enjoyed riding around the back of a transit as much as riding around in a Learjet, really. The thing is, it's a bit like motor racing. Actually, it's as much fun racing a, Chevaux Citroën as it is some rather elegant Porsche. The big thing is about the activity, so playing music, whether you play it to 100 people or 50,000, it's not that different. It's a matter of enjoying the whole thing of playing it, full stop. And in terms of decade, who else was playing at the time? Of course, that sort of 60s, early 70s period is important because that's the point at which you're being influenced so much and listening more passionately, I suppose. But I don't think there's I think there's as much good music around now as there's ever been. Not really, I mean, they're all, they all have, I mean, they're sort of almost like a diary, that they're a reminder of a period. So, different periods, different memories. Not sort of, but there's probably a dozen songs that I'd say that I would particularly like, because they're more fun to play. So they tend to be the songs that have the most scope for improvisation. Again, it always comes back to that thing, the people who influenced you originally. So Cream, Hendrix, I suppose probably there's some Hendrix songs, and probably something like that maybe has Bob Dylan lyrics, so you get the sort of at least two for one. My eldest daughter is a producer in music television in particular, so she's sort of the closest to being really engaged in it. The others have all got proper jobs, or studying towards that. It's been a journey, and I don't see it as it'd be terrible to look back and be going, oh well, that was great, and ever since then it's been downhill. Oh, terrible.
I'd like to introduce Nick Mason from Pink Floyd, who's kindly agreed to talk to us about his cover story in Mad, Bad and Dangerous, The Book of Drummers' Tales. Nick, firstly, thanks a million for agreeing to chat to us.
Pleasure.
One of the stories featured in the book of Mad, Bad and Dangerous is your experience playing along a pre-programmed drum track back in 1982 in Mayfair. I believe it was the first Lindrum invention, was it not?
Well, of course, I can remember absolutely nothing about it. So I think, as I say, all I really remember about it was that it was probably an early click track, whether it was Lind generated or who knows at the time. But it was certainly something I wasn't particularly comfortable with.
Yes, I've always hated playing with click tracks. I've never really liked it. And the first time for me was always a little bit funny. But how was that for you then when you were actually first?
Well, actually, it was pretty disastrous, really, and the famous moment was when James Guthrie, the most wonderful engineer, incredibly diplomatic, finally plucked up the courage to come into the studio to talk to me and sort of quietly to tell me that actually, what was the word he used?
Did you use the word discrepancies?
Yes, that there seemed to be slight discrepancies between this rhythm track and what I was playing.
Is there something to do with the timekeeping?
Yeah, it was slightly off anyway, and it was probably a long way off, really. But apparently, because I of course don't remember this now, but I looked at him and said, James, the fact of the matter is that timekeeping's never really been my strong point. I've always been better at the after-show party.
If you need someone to take the sting out of a situation, always ask a drummer. One of the themes that runs through the book is this notion that drummers might by nature be a little bit mad. Not just the ones who drive cars into swimming pools or smash up hotel rooms, but all of us. You know, is there something a bit mad about all of us? What do you think?
Well, I think there's a couple of things points to make here. The people who are usually accusing us of being mad are the sort of what Gary Wallace likes to call the novelty acts, i.e. guitar players and singers, who are clearly demented and hardly really in a position to judge, in my opinion.
The strutting peacocks. Well, I mean, Steve White says it's far from being mad. It's the sanest instrument you can play because it's nearest to the heart. It's rhythm. It's one of the first forms of communication, all that, and smoke signals. Whereas Topper Headon says you've got to be mad to do it in the first place because you've got to spend a year or so upsetting people before you can even play with anyone. But I take it you go along with the idea that actually it's probably the most therapeutic and.
I think it's therapeutic. I think there are aspects of it that are completely insane. I mean, who on earth would, when you have a wide range of musical instruments available, why would you pick the one that's seems to demand a sort of full Louis Vuitton set of luggage in order to move around? I mean, the only thing worse than that is the piano.
Yes, yeah. And if anything goes wrong, then you are pretty well scuppered. If you hurt any part of your body or your limbs or whatever, a finger or anything, then you've had it. If you're ill, you need all that stamina to play and all that kind of thing.
Not in my case. My doctor said never play any song that's faster than your pulse rate.
Good advice indeed. Have you ever had a really dreadful experience in terms of having to play when you're ill or injured, like on a tour when you just can't duck out?
Injured, no. Apart from I pulled some muscles in my neck or back or something, which happened on a couple of occasions. But in fact, fortuitously, it was a period when we were playing music for the Ballet de Marseille, and they, of course, had a full-time masseur chiropractor on their books for dancers who were always hurting themselves really badly. So, in fact, I had some help on that. I remember that. Probably a couple of times when running temperatures and things like that, but actually I always found that strong alcohol and...
yes, I suppose that kind of helps.
I've touch wood, never really. I don't think we've ever had to pull a show for being ill that I can remember.
The drummers are a kind of, seems to be, on the research that I did for this book, it seems that they will go through virtually anything to continue with it. They will not let anyone down, least of all themselves. And Steve Grant, he played with, he was drugged up to the eyeballs he had pneumonia. He could hardly sort of breathe. It was playing tours well.
Well, they can always gaffer take you to the seat, which gives you an advantage over again over the people who have to stand up. Someone once said to me something about, what's your sort of playing position? And I said, well, actually, a lot of it is like this.
There's so much else going on.
There's quite often sort of lengthy passages where keyboard's wittering away or steel guitar or something.
Did you ever sort of lose concentration such that you failed to come in?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it is that. Well, it's the famous story of the actors who go out for a drink at lunchtime and come back in, and he's not on till the scene 3 or something, and he's sitting next to his mate because they sit at the back to watch, and he goes, "Oh, this is great. This is where I come in."
But Nick, thanks so much for talking to us.
Pleasure.
And hopefully there'll be a book too, and we'll get to chat.
I think that'd be a really good idea. Mad, Bad and Dangerous, a book I highly recommend. Spike takes over where Marcel Proust left off. Well, I've come to Paiste today to try some cymbals out. The question is why, considering that over many years I've actually accumulated a lot of cymbals. And the reason really is because one tends to be unaware of all the developments that go on all the time with drum equipment and musical instruments and cymbals in particular. And there's at least 2 new ranges that I think are really interesting. And it would be silly not to at least give them a sound out. My history with Paiste goes back a long way. In fact, I'd started with the company in, I think, 71, when we were playing the Montreux Jazz Festival, and someone from Paiste came and saw me after the show and said, would I be interested in endorsing the cymbals? And this was the first, my first inkling that anything like this might even existed. The idea of someone actually giving me some cymbals was frankly wonderful. I said it's a bit like meeting Father Christmas. And from then on, it actually has been a great relationship, because over the years I've tried a lot of the different versions of cymbals, and well, I've never needed to play anything else. We've tried a whole bunch of things, mainly concentrating on ride cymbals, because I think that for me the ride cymbal is the most important cymbal in the collection. It does in so many ways. It does so much more work. thing about the ride cymbal is all those tones and overtones that come out with it that create, so it's not only about the rhythm and the sound, it's all those underlying tones that come with it. It's really interesting going back to the sort of old favourites. What we've tended to find is that some of the elder cymbals still sound incredibly good, and in fact Paiste have been remaking some of the early models, which has been fascinating to hear them now and to hear them again. The 2002 is something that I used for many, many years, in fact until I added some signature, some of the signature range. But it's still, it is a definitive ride cymbal for me. And what's so interesting is that the 20s in particular are the sort of the next generation of the same thing in some ways. They do have a slightly different sound and a different tone, but they still do the same job. That they still have that great sound. It's the interaction between them that interests me particularly today, and looking at this dark dry ride, for instance, which is something is rather different to anything I've played before, but I love the idea of maybe having something that switches between what I might call the classic ride into a slightly different sound, so that particularly if you've got a song, a fairly lengthy song where there's quite a long ride part for it, that maybe switching between two will give another dynamic to the music. What I like really is this constant development, this sense that of trying to push and find out what new sounds are wanted and what people would like, because of course there aren't very many drummers who imagine a sound beyond what they're hearing, and I certainly don't think I imagine a sound beyond what I'm playing. It's a matter of very much of coming in and listening to a whole variety of sounds and going, yeah, I really like that one, or I really like that one. And of course with a drum kit, switching between, it's not just one cymbal, it's the way they all interact together. So crashes that match, but much more as well, again talking about rides, that maybe different songs, changes in the music you're playing, sometimes suit the idea of maybe changing the way your cymbals sound. I'd like to take the opportunity to say thank you again to Paiste for 40 years of looking after my cymbals and supplying me. Very pleased to be here in the new Emporium in Milton Keynes, where they've actually got a room that you can really experiment with the sounds in, which is absolutely terrific. So thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Terry Bozzio. Welcome to Drum Channel. I have a very special show for you today. I'm kind of in awe and speechless, and as usual have no plan whatsoever, which has just been a great thing. Ever since we started, we have no plan, and it all works out. But my special guest is a very iconic gentleman, and he told me before the show, we had a little discussion, and I guess it's okay for me to call you Pink. And sorry, I couldn't resist. No, my special guest is the wonderful drummer from Pink Floyd, Mr. Nick Mason. First of all, welcome, sir.
Thank you very much.
Great to see you again, and I'm really happy to have you here. You are probably the biggest celebrity that we have had here.
I don't think so. I think I'm sitting on hallowed ground.
No, well,
I've seen the list of some of the people who've been
There's
up here.
been a lot of great drummers here, and a lot of great music has come out of this little area where we're sitting. But yeah, in terms of, I cannot think of anybody, huger than you. So another one of my lucky brush with greatnesses. So I should just tell them my little story about you before we begin, which is I was in England working with Jeff Beck, and during the weekends I would come into London and hang out, and I was going to meetings, and I met a woman there who was sort of I think in the business, and we kind of became just weekend friends. And she said, this weekend, are you busy? She knew I was alone and not doing anything. And she said, I've got a drummer friend, and we were all going to go out to dinner. Do you want to come along? And I said, oh, yeah, sure. So she came and picked me up at my hotel. And we drove, and she didn't say anything. And before I knew it, I was in your house, and you were cooking dinner for me, which was a tremendous surprise and a wonderful experience. And I'll never forget that. So thank you for the cooking and the evening, and getting me out of my loneliness and everything else.
Oh, no, pleasure. And I have to say my version of the story is more or less the same, but with the difference that I remember it was Denise O'Donoghue.
Yeah, Denise.
Actually, I think godmother to one of our boys. And she said, oh, I've got a friend, he's a drummer, and, might bring him over. And I said, oh, that'd be terrific, thinking, fantastic, I'll show off. And she said, it's Terry Bozzio. And I went, what? No, you can't bring him. I'm frightened.
No, man. I'm just so not a threat.
No, I realize that now.
I love to play, and I suppose you get that animalistic, primitive thing out when you play, and I suppose there's a lot of persona, and well, I don't know, for me, a lot of those darker emotions come out when I play, which I think enables me to be a rather nice guy, in normal life. I don't feel like murdering anybody.
Well, we could try sort of maybe encouraging the use of drums as an entirely therapeutic thing for particularly difficult people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Change world history.
Yeah.
If Stalin had played the drums.
Yeah, it might have been a whole different ballgame.
Yeah.
But what can we do now? Gosh, so where would you like to begin? I mean, as an interviewer, and here on Drum Channel, it's always just been about two drummers talking about whatever the hell they want to talk about. And, with you, you're such a deep cat, equally deep in your private life, as well as the thing that probably everybody who's watching here envies you for, which is being in such a hugely fantastic, successful rock band. So, I mean, what I normally do is just keep it simple and start with, how did you get into drums as a child? What made you want to play? And
well, I think there were two things, really. The first was a great friend of my parents who was keen on jazz and played piano. And he actually gave me a pair of wire brushes for a Christmas present when I was, I should think, 12, 13, something like that. And I just sort of started messing around with that. And I loved the thing of playing. I actually liked that thing of being part of an ensemble, whether it's a duo or any number of people. And perhaps that's part of the sort of thinking that connected me with drums. I mean, the other reason was because when I was a little older, we actually started a band with some friends. None of us had ever played instruments before, but we more or less sat down and went, oh, well, I'll buy a guitar, said one of the. And I thought, I don't want to be a bass player. So I went out and bought a drum kit. Never actually owned a pair of sticks even.
Wow.
But just thought, yeah, this could be good.
And what were those?
Went from there.
What were those early days like? Just fooling around in the garage, sort of?
Yeah, absolutely fooling around. And because my dad was involved in documentary film, he actually had a tape recorder. So we actually started recording before we actually bothered to learn to play the instruments. So they're quite frightening tapes. I
can imagine.
And I think one of the band had decided to buy a saxophone, but hadn't understood about the high pitch thing. So consequently, it was always out of tune.
Oh God!
Didn't help.
Yeah. Now, did you listen to those tapes? Was that a learning tool for you? Because I mean, most of us.
There was nothing to be learned from them. I have to tell you, apart from hubris, a sort of understanding of the curious things kids do.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we touched on just earlier today was this thing about talking about influences in terms of rock music, because there was so little to go on when one started. And in fact, all the big influences came further down the line in the mid-'60s, I think. But actually, I've no idea who Bill Haley's drummer was even, and the idea of sort of session players and who they were and who was, say, working with Elvis. I'm thinking about when I first started hearing rock and roll. There really wasn't very much to go on, and in fact, a lot of the influences were drawn from the jazz players, and particularly the sort of Art Blakey, the bebop sort of era players.
Yeah.
And I think they were the early influences, although in some ways they had so little to do with the patterns that you were playing in early rock and roll.
Yeah, but there was sort of a swing and a lope because of this transition. You know, the guys who could get the sessions usually came from jazz. And
yeah, absolutely. And further down the line, it was Phil Seaman, of course, in the UK, who was the big influence on Ginger Baker, who was the big influence on me.
Yeah. Me too. He was one of my favorites. I liked Mitch Mitchell. And
Mitch is a really interesting player because, in a way, his background was not really jazz, but he's perhaps the jazziest player of them all.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
And you know, the lovely sort of touch that worked so well, I think, with Hendrix.
Yeah, he was wonderful. Now, so. In those days, what can you remember? I mean, I remember, let's say, I think this may have been the 60s too, but say Gene Pitney had, a couple of hits. There was Town Without Pity and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. That tune, that single had a little drum fill at the end that I would put over and over, dun, 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 you know. That's one of the earliest things I can think of before, surf music and stuff like that featured the drums a bit more and became an influence for me. Did you have any?
I mean, I'm trying to think of what period would it have been, but it was Sandy Nelson who was the first sort of drum feature on a single with Teen Beat. And then, of course, they had, we had Dave Clark 5, who was the sort of leader of the band, which was a fairly breakthrough in terms of rock music. Not perhaps the most influential drummer.
But he did have double shell toms, and whoever saw those before. Yeah, very interesting. And so from there, how did you sort of?
Well, then I think it was probably I just continued to mess around as playing. I mean, I really wasn't serious about it. We didn't really have any. The band, that early band, sort of disappeared because that was sort of local kids, and then I went off to school and so on. And it really didn't happen again until I was at college, and I was studying to be an architect, and as my mother said, fell in with a bad lot, and that was Roger Waters and Richard Wright.
Yeah.
And it just happened after a year or so that someone wanted some people to play. They'd written some songs and they needed someone to play them to a publisher, I think. And he said, "Does anyone here play instruments?" And I think all three. Well, Rick actually was more serious about the piano and played regularly, but Roger played a bit of guitar and so on. So I think we just went, "Oh yeah, well I used to play a little bit." And actually, once you sort of start playing again, you think, "Yeah, this is great."
Yeah.
And
you did say, I did hear you correctly. You said a puppet show.
No.
Oh, okay. Then I misunderstood.
Oh, publisher.
A publisher.
A
I'm
publisher.
Sorry. Yes.
Yeah. No.
Okay. Because I was just going to say, oh my God,
Yes, that was
Spinal Tap, yeah. But
Nice
actually,
idea.
that fits in with the surrealistic
Yeah.
bent that you did ultimately get into there.
Punch and Judy the musical.
Yeah.
Might be something to work on.
So you guys got together and there
We
was
got
just
together,
chemistry?
we played these songs. The publisher hated the band and loved the songs, which probably drove Roger sort of to push a bit harder. And then we sort of, what actually happened was we had a sort of college band that played for the odd sort of events. But we had someone who was a part-time lecturer who worked at one of the art colleges where they were working on light and sound things. And we started providing the music for their workshops. And the timing was right. You know, people were interested in this whole sort of thing of light and sound and so on. And so we started to get a following. And about the same time, Sid Barrett joined the band because he'd come down from Cambridge to go to Camberwell Art School. And he was fantastic. He was writing songs, and good guitar player. I mean, not great, but a great sort of frontman for the band. And we found a manager, found an agent, and then, of course, the record companies were interested, and we ended up sort of launching into the music business.
Yeah.
And in a way, it was looking back, we're talking sort of 40-something years ago now, it was a relatively simple ladder, really. And it shows, I just think, if you look at the music industry now, how tough it is for young bands to get started, because once you were on that rung, everyone had a roughly equal chance. And particularly in the UK, there are lots of singles being released every week. And how good is it? The people would hear it maybe on the radio, or it was a sort of much simpler thing. And I do understand now how difficult it is for a new band to ever get their music heard, because you can't play live. Well, I mean, you can play live, but it's very difficult to even find a venue that will pay you to play. It's fine if you're about over 70 years old and working live and have been around for that amount of time. There's lots of money to be made, but really tough, I think, now for young bands.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about it for myself, It's a difficult time. The music business is really, if it's going to survive, is going through a tremendous restructuring, and I think they're holding on to whatever the lowest common denominator is of the pop machine and what have you. And like you say, guys who are established can always, go out and work. And, I'm going back to 1978 for myself and doing a UK reunion, That's one of my options, and I'm taking it, But yeah, in terms of the progression and the freedom, it's a different time, and it's a sad thing. In the 60s, it really was sort of open,
Yeah, it was. But on the other hand, I think there are some things that I'm quite envious of now. One of which is the fact that schools absolutely embrace the idea of teaching rock music rather than classical. Yeah. And I mean, when I was a kid, if I'd suggested the music master, no, I didn't want to play the violin, I'd like to play the drums.
Yeah.
I think if it had a fit. I have to say, watching young drummers now, I mean, they're blisteringly good.
Yeah.
And you, in terms of the technique, they're so far ahead of most of the people I know even. I remember they invited me to be on a panel judging a young drummer thing. And I was with some great English players. There was Ian Pace and Carl Brazil, I think. And, this 14-year-old goes on stage and starts playing, and we're all going, how does he do that?
Yeah.
I mean, it was fantastic.
Yeah.
And so in terms of ability, there's a lot out there.
Oh, yeah.
There really is, I think.
Yeah. I just find it frustrating that they don't have an outlet. I've had some of the greatest drummers in the world here, a technical, on any level. They will move you, they'll blow your mind out of the box. And but what they do to make a living is not that. You'd never know what they can really do, behind this artist or that artist, just back there keeping a beat and making some dough. And that I find sad, because, Ginger Baker could show what he had.
Yeah.
Mitch Mitchell could show what he had. And, I wish that there was not so much emphasis on, what have you, The Voice and American Idol and these kinds of things that you just, don't really...
Yeah. I think, I mean, I agree with you, although I think one has to sort of almost separate out, certainly in the UK, almost the confusion that suggests that something like Pop Idol is really a genuine route to success in the music industry. What it is or generally it appears to be a sort of very short-term opportunity to do something, but it isn't that music career, because the people with television voting, that fan base who voted you number one will not be out next Saturday night to see you at the local theatre. They'll be back watching television voting for the next person. So you get this sort of absolute non-starting thing all the time. And certainly So I say in the UK, the number of real people who've made a sort of living in the music industry, there's very few of them, actually. There's, I can only think of 3 or 4, and that's it.
Yeah.
After that, it's sort of been and gone.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you, to some extent, just separate. My feeling is you separate them out. And as I say, I think if you've got enough kids playing and who want to play, they'll eventually come through. I think in a way, what's happening now is that the skill set required for success in the music industry is different to what it was. I think 40 years ago, you needed a lot of drive and a lot of ability and all the rest of it. But now you need some entrepreneurial skills as well. So you have to be a sort of micro business thing about how you're going to promote yourself and how you're going to make the thing happen on the web and whether you can make the viral video that'll catch the imagination.
Yeah. And that just raises a little resentment in me with, like my son right now is doing some great work. He's a drummer as well. And they're working and they produce these things and they put them out on the web for free. Yeah. And, it bugs me that, they don't have an outlet like radio or, here in Los Angeles, we had a semi-progressive little, K-rock in the 80s would take local bands, and so I was able to, make a meal out of Missing Persons there. But, we went and handed the single to the guy on a Sunday night, and they played it on the independent, band show, and it took off, If they do this on the internet, they sort of are buying into this crowd that just feels entitled to get something for free.
Absolutely, and that is a big problem. But that, hopefully, is one of the things that over a period of time could be changed. Yeah. It is about education. It is about people. And again, if their friends realise that the only way these guys can make the music is if someone actually pays them, we'll gradually get there. There is still, I think there's... I can hear myself revving up to this one. But there's some history that is not helpful, I think, one of which is that people feel that they've been overcharged for music in the past, which I think they have. The record companies have, I think the whole CD thing was expensive, unnecessarily so. And I think there's always that feeling that, rock stars have more money than they need anyway, and they're entitled to download for free. The trouble is the definition of a rock star, and most people don't have much of an idea of where people are in that
I'm
grading.
Sitting here next to you, and I'm struggling to make my rent, right? but they may think that...
but that's the thing. They think, I've heard the name, so he's famous, so he's rich.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. What happens is it only needs sort of the name of the band to be on the web, and people go, oh, well, they must be successful. Yeah. So there's some changes that need to be understood. Yeah,
a little awareness, and I think ethics are involved as well, and I hope that parents will, step up and do that. And I don't know, but I guess for myself, I made the choice a while back to just go, well, if I can just make a living, and as long as I get to do what I would like to do, what I think is best in my heart, playing the drums, which is not, really commercial, then I'm happy, and that's okay with me. But as you see your opportunities to even do that disappear, that makes you worry about, well, maybe I've gone the wrong way, or maybe, and for the sake of others in the music business, what can we do as a culture to keep live music around, you know. There's not a lot of places to play for free or to pay, or in Los Angeles, the Baked Potato is the only place that gives the band the door, and makes a living. That's because the guy who founded that was a musician. Right. His son, who's still, running that place, is keeping the tradition to...
Well, I think we live in hope. I mean, I do think we're probably in a particularly tricky period at the moment in that respect. No. I think particularly if you have kids playing, you're really sort of living the problem. Yeah. My son plays, but he's not professional. But I mean, in terms of a band, there's no opportunity really for being paid to play.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, most, my son, a lot of his friends have day jobs, and then, that takes a lot of energy, and then they've got to spend their spare time putting out more energy, to try and make the music thing happen.
Well, we shouldn't spend too long on the disaster that is the music business, but having said that, one other story, just to add to that one, is the fact that we've just come back from New Zealand. The band there that have had 3 number ones are all still on welfare, because... Wow. There is, the number one is dictated by number of downloads as well as record sales, and that's how it is.
Yeah, yeah.
So it is tough out there.
Well, let's keep them in our prayers, for God's sakes. That's a new one for me. We'll take a short break. We'll be right back with more Nick Mason. I love architecture. Well, who were your favorite architects?
Well, we were rather privileged, really, because we used to have a couple of part-timers who would come in and give some tuition. And one was Richard Rogers, now Sir Richard Rogers, and the other was Sir Norman Foster. So we actually had some fairly heavy influences there. I think both of those, I think, are terrific. Having said that, Frank Gehry, and I think some of the sort of the American skyscraper architects. Yeah.
I like Le Corbusier and Breuer and what's his name?
Well, Corbusier, I mean, wonderful sort of thinking and wonderful, interesting stuff, but in some ways alarmingly wrong in some ways, in that sense of great idea of putting the living areas on stilts with beautiful flowing parkland, unaware that the motor car was going to absolutely take over the world, and you'd end up with the same thing, but with the car park underneath instead of the lovely. Yeah,
I think he had fantastic ideas, but in the terms of an idealist. Otherwise, I think it was a bit fascist, and like he had his system, and that was kind of it. But I love his designs. I love the fact that when I saw those things, first time I saw his furniture, for instance. Was in the 80s, and it was made in the 20s, and I was like, what? This looks like futuristic, and it was, So
no, there's some of the sort of that furniture thing that architects do when they actually think through not only the building but what goes in it.
Yeah. It's a whole design, creative thing. So from there now, we're.
We've only got as far as 67, haven't we?
Yeah, God. Well, from there, I mean, you've gotten into Pink Floyd. Drugs were a part of this situation. Possibly it helped to open the minds of, I came from San Francisco in the hippie thing as a teenager. So, we had that kind of atmosphere where there was the light shows with the globules and the hippie bands and the smell of marijuana and everybody on acid. But the great thing was with a guy like Bill Graham is you'd have Ravi Shankar, from India, Charles Lloyd, a jazz guy, and the Grateful Dead all on one show.
That's right.
And this eclecticism was accepted, and you had an open-minded audience that equated them all as just a part of their experience.
That was, in fact, that was one of our first sort of big adventures. Our first sort of playing outside England was 1967, I think, and playing the Winterland with Janis Joplin. Janis Joplin, a band called H.P. Lovecraft, and Richie Havens, who was fantastic.
A staple. Yeah,
absolutely.
He was the opening act for almost everybody. Yeah, great voice too. I love him. But those were really special times. And, for me in America, the AM radio was top 40 and you had some soul and everything. But then suddenly there was this otherwise FM. Black dial that you could maybe get police calls on called FM radio. Yeah. And suddenly that was alive with all this new weird stuff, blues from Chicago, black people's music, that, we didn't know. The English stuff we were listening to came from black people in the United States that we were totally unaware of. So it was an interesting time. And you lived this.
Yeah, and enormously influential, because we'd come to America and we really could, there was so little music played on English radio. They had a lot of union issues about how many records they were allowed to play, and most of the rest of the time they'd have a regular band who were there to play whatever the hits were. And I can still remember very clearly this sort of big band attempting to do an arrangement of Purple Haze.
Wow.
But it was, I still have that, I still arrive in America seeing it as the promised land, because it was the land of those, the way the vinyl was packed was different to the UK, with the stiffer record sleeve. And, you know, we'd come back from the tour with just piles of records with all these, I'm trying to think who the blues band was that...
Paul Butterfield?
Yes, Paul Butterfield. Well done.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and you'd think, oh yeah, no, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
You know, it really was. It was sort of so different to, I suppose, our equivalent was perhaps Spencer Davis, was you know, with his brothers.
Yeah.
And Steve Winwood.
Yeah, that was some great stuff too. We were just talking about that, Chris and I, the engineer, the other day. How young and how amazingly deep and old, an old soul, you know.
But also, you know, groundbreaking was Iron Butterfly in the Gada de Vida.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, this idea of actually having a track that ran for 25 minutes or whatever.
Yeah. And a lot of drums, you know.
That
was
no, absolutely.
some great stuff.
Bigger and bigger drum kit.
Yeah. So, how do you, I mean, can you give us, say, a day in the life in the 60s when you first came of Pink Floyd? I mean, what kind of level of...
Well, of course, it changed radically over a period, you know, over a period of time, because the big thing was that 1967 really was when we had the record deal and we started work. And suddenly we were touring, but touring then was an absolute random sort of business. It wasn't an organised tour at all. You had a van, the equipment, and an agent who went, well, you're in the Isle of Man tonight, and then tomorrow you can do the Isle of Wight, which is, you know, quite a big trip. So we were driving. I mean, this was the big thing. You were just all over the motorways, as was every other band. So you'd meet up at about 3 a.m. or somewhere on the motorway in one of the service stations, which there weren't very many. And there'd just be these rows of Ford Transit vans parked up, and there'd be, you know, it'd be Cream and us and the Move and that's how it worked. That's how the industry worked.
Yeah.
And then, of course, what's again so different to the way things became. You recorded in between all that. So you maybe had a couple of days at Abbey Road, and then you were back on that would be Monday, Tuesday, and then you'd be Wednesday, Thursday, or Thursday, Friday, Saturday would be playing.
Yeah.
And of course so that was sort of 67, 68, and then 69 it began to change. It became a bit more sort of organised, I suppose, with the idea of touring and then having a period when you were touring and then maybe doing some stuff in Europe or even the American tour. And then more organised recording, because the other thing about the early recording time was that if you were at Abbey Road, it was very geared to sessions. There were 3-hour sessions, and you had the morning or the afternoon or sometimes the evening. But no one had really thought that they would run through from one to the other. There'd be someone else someone had the morning, someone else had the afternoon.
So the lockout concept.
And that changed, really. I suppose it did start to change in 67, although it didn't really affect many people initially. But it was the Beatles, because the Beatles were doing Sgt. Pepper, and that absolutely changed the way people thought about albums, because suddenly the record companies realised that albums I think Sgt. Pepper was the first album to outsell a single. And so that was the major change, because they suddenly realised that the album was important, and it was much easier to just do the lockout and work from that.
Yeah, and then I suppose as a concept album, that was pretty
well, we did, I suppose, you know, I suppose Sgt. Pepper was in some ways was the first concept album, because it wasn't so much a concept as just something that was so clearly worked as one thing
unit,
rather than an opportunity to sell the
collection.
single with a bunch of other stuff. For us, I mean, I suppose our first, in terms of a concept album, didn't come for another 5 years with Dark Side.
Now, in this period, you guys, say, first time you came to the States, what was it the same sort of level of disorganization, not really well-organized touring?
It was dreadful.
Yeah.
My big memory was that at the time I was, I'd got a deal with Premier Drums, and the arrangement was that when we got to America, that Premier would supply a kit. Well, no one seemed to have told the Americans this, and so there wasn't a kit. And a rather grudging agent, I think, started trying to sort something out. And sorting something out meant that eventually the kit ended up being sort of 3 different colours in one kit. So it was, and just trying to make all the fittings work. And well, you know what it's like.
Yeah.
So it was pretty chaotic. And we carried very little equipment. And the equipment we did carry was U-Haul some of the time, and we'd actually take it on the aeroplanes, the rest, because you were allowed, I think it was $10 a bag or something, so we'd arrive with 63 bags, of, which included the amps and the guitar cases, and do it like that.
Yeah, that part was easier. I remember being able to tip a sky cap and get a whole band full of equipment on the plane, but no longer. So from there, you guys chugged away. How, in terms of the drugs and the interpersonal relationships, and especially the situation with Syd Barrett, I've been through a couple of these situations, and they're a living hell. What was your experience with that?
Well, I think looking back on it, we were so naive. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I think Syd probably scared the rest of us off drugs, really. I mean, I wouldn't describe us as drug-free, but in terms of where we actually ended up, I think, particularly as we headed towards Dark Side, was we became much more professional, actually. And I think having had the whole Syd experience of the chaos of working with someone who didn't want to work or couldn't function properly, really made us conscious of the fact that we wanted to do this seriously. And I think, in all the time we've played together, I've never really ever thought that any of us were anything other than absolutely, well, if not absolutely straight. Certainly, I've never had that moment on stage where I've thought, this guy isn't entirely there.
Yeah.
So I think although we have a reputation as being the sort of space cadets, the reality was rather different.
Yeah, much like Zappa, I would imagine.
Yes,
this was
actually perfect example.
Yeah.
The wild man of rock, but actually the most disciplined.
Yeah. Well, can you? What was your feelings at that time? I mean, at my situation was a dear friend and a band member had mental illness, and everybody's absolutely depressed and doing whatever codependent things and trying to control the uncontrollable. Same thing with a lead singer, ex-wife, and here you have your relationship as well as your income and everything, all wrapped up in one person. So that was a very difficult and challenging time for me.
I think we were so far away from understanding what was going on. I think it's in hindsight it's much easier to look at it, and I think it's almost laughable how innocent we were, and how unsympathetic, because it's exactly as you say, you're looking at your sort of living, your livelihood, but also your ambition. So this guy is actually working against what you want to do. So you're actually quite angry rather than helpful. And as I say, being wise after the event, we should have done so much more at the time. I'm not sure it would have changed very much, but it would have made everything happier, perhaps for everyone. Yeah. But we didn't, because we didn't understand. So we kept going, well, Syd's not very well, so what we should do is take a day off. Which meant that it was simply a day later, it was still the same problem. So it was really sort of, you know, as I say, looking back on it, you just think,
Yeah.
why didn't we get it?
And you had managers, I'm sure, who were trying to enable.
Yes, and they were in the same state. They wanted it to be okay for Sid, but actually they really, really wanted us to go and do the Reading Festival or whatever it was, because that was, you know, that was income and so on. And it's really surprising in a way that when Sid eventually left, or when we actually sort of pushed Sid out, that we didn't have any history of other writers in the band, really. And yet we were by now so sort of committed to what we wanted to do, it wasn't a problem. And in fact, we immediately really started enjoying the whole thing of playing again and so on. And I think perhaps it happens with bands, sometimes with people leaving and so on, that you re-energize the band by those sort of events. I mean, I'm really quite sort of fascinated sometimes by the way people come and go, and how in some cases the band is instantly destroyed or breaks up, and in other cases it continues sometimes in a very, very different way.
Yeah. That's interesting. With me, you know, I think, you know, we have a lot more public awareness now of 12-step programs and interventions and rehabs and these kinds of things that can help. But it's still a nightmare, you know, nightmarish situation to go through.
Yes, I mean, even, you know, it can even be in the crew rather than the band and have a big effect. And we had probably 2 or 3 times that sort of thing, and I have to say, looking back, every time we managed to not quite understand what was going on, deal with it really badly.
We were just talking about Mitch Mitchell and his feel, and this can transition into what I want to ask you about, what we were talking about earlier. But for me, Mitch Mitchell kind of has this wonderful blend of, I hear a lot of Buddy Rich, that fire, and that, you know, the chops and the rudimental aspect. Tony Williams and Elvin Jones, that little bit of influence there where he would kind of freely solo over the time. The idea of playing texturally, I really liked when he would solo. He could just do different types of rolls and moves around the kit that were just a wonderful thing to behold.
It was an extraordinary sort of combination, really, with just Noel holding it all steady, but sometimes you almost hear Mitch surfing on the guitar. Rhythmically, which I absolutely love.
Now, you recently spoken with a professor from an English...
Yes, a friend of mine's a professor at one of the English music colleges, and he did some research into this idea that there is an English school and there's an American school of drumming, which I think is possibly true. I mean, you're always a bit sort of suspicious of these things, but the general idea was, and I've talked to Alan White about this, who sort of goes along with it, I think, that the English tend to maybe just hang back a bit, slightly pulling it back, whereas the Americans are perhaps, I won't say in advance at all, I think they're almost more precise than the UK players in that respect. But it was I thought a really interesting idea, because I hadn't thought very hard about how the drums sort of work, you know. I tended to spend... I just sort of tend to play, do whatever's necessary, whatever. But it was an interesting idea that actually where the beat falls is not a small space. It's actually quite a large space that's available, and it's where you place the beat within that space that gives the feel. And there's a point outside where it's actually out of time, let's say. But that is the thing so often that does give it that feel, and I think there is that thing with a really nice fill and or whatever, where you can actually make the listener sort of almost take a breath because they're waiting for that moment to fall and bring it down. And I'm interested. I suppose I'm asking you really what your feeling is about this one.
I'm really interested in this too, and it's a slippery slope. It's time is relative, so. It's relative to what other people are playing around you, if there's spaces left around you. I'm not so sure I I agree with the nationalistic generality of English, and because you know how I always looked at it, just in my figurative imagination, was when you play pool or snooker or something, they say put a little English. There's a spin. There's a little humanity there that I find unique to all humans. There is a huge cultural influence in certain respects, and then you find anomalies to that cultural influence all the time too. But there is a unique individuality amongst all drummers in terms of how they feel and how they can change the essence of what's going on in music rhythmically. And I'm not quite sure what it is, but it does have to do with where they place the time, what their sort of intention is, and then the context within which that we play, because it's difficult to play a certain way in certain contexts. Maybe, like for instance, with Miles Davis, Tony Williams, I felt was very much on top, and pushing, and he would actually rush when the head was finished and into the solos and just make the solo section really have a lift and an excitement to it. Then as music changes, maybe that became inappropriate, and who knows, with the advent of click tracks and more produced music, that wasn't something as desirable to have in your arsenal, and you'd be criticized for imitating one of your great influences. So and then there's something that happens with natural musicians, say from Africa or from Cuba. And I mean, Cuba is a very interesting blend of the Spanish and the African cultures, and then the highly educated aspect that they have, and the precision and the coordination in Cuban music, like rumba and all the stuff they play. That's really interesting to me in terms of time feel. It's just so on that you can hear it off and it still sounds on, and you go, oh, okay, here's one. It's just so strong. And in African music, there's this kind of nebulous thing that can happen where you don't really know if you're feeling this in 4 or in 3. It's somewhere kind of in a crack where they resonate more on something that has to do with the harmonic overtone series, which rhythm and polyrhythms relate to on a technical level. But we've quantized, like a dum 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 is actually 3, against 2, but it's not, da da dum dum da da dum, it's dum da da dum da. So we've quantized that to suit the surrounding music. Whereas with African drumming, I can just go through a whole tune of these guys playing and just go, I can feel this in 4, or I could feel this in 3 another time. You can feel 1 in different places. Yeah. And I love that
the
big
Burundi drummers do that.
Yeah, Burundi drummers, the Ghana drummers. There's so many styles, too. The Senegalese Sabar stuff is one of my favorites, and that's just really funky and really coordinated and interesting sounds because they have a stick and a head. And so there's lots of color and texture changes, and then a groove with some amazing polyrhythmic themes over it too. So I just love all that stuff, We're gonna have to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Mr. Thompson, when he got with Genesis, Phil Collins told him to play just this straight 4/4 beat, just like this. And he goes, just like you're walking. And Chester couldn't get it, right? And he said, just like you're walking. And Chester said, well, man, where I come from, people don't walk that way. And, it's something he had to learn to play in a more stiff, laid-back way, where Chester had more of a, the funk Baltimore jazz core to his expression. So
no, it is extraordinary when you start thinking about it, and you think about all these different drummers and the ways that they interpret the music and the way it affects the sound of the thing. I mean, I'm thinking of, funnily enough, of Fleetwood Mac and that sort of business of using the tom rather than the bass drum necessarily to set the pace. But
Yeah, I mean, he's a great example. I always, cite Ringo Starr. Without Ringo Starr, the Beatles wouldn't feel the same. Just wouldn't be the same thing.
perfect example,
Yeah.
because there's always that sort of thing about John Lennon saying he's not even the best drummer in the Beatles. It's sort of missing the point for when people start looking at it like that, because if you'd put Ginger Baker in the Beatles, I don't think it would have been a comfortable sit. Much as even though Ginger was for me the ultimate sort of hero of rock drums.
Yeah,
and it's that thing about it being right for the moment.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel Charlie Watts has that interesting thing for the Stones, too. I just wouldn't want to see another drummer with the Stones. And I got to play with Mick Jagger, and I really felt like, I'm the wrong kind of guy for him. Like there's, this is another, I'll transition, because I really use like Mick Jagger as like sort of a classic car, like a Model T. That's like a jalopy. It's got this loose, funny thing to it. And I'm like maybe more of a Ferrari or technically, inclined drummer that it just doesn't work. They're both beautiful cars.
Yeah.
So let's transition into cars. You have a fascinating extracurricular life from rock and roll. How did you get into, for those of you who don't know, he is a huge classic car collector. How many cars do you have in your collection?
30-something.
30, and you do have like one of the most expensive Ferraris, right? Sports cars in the world?
Yes, I do. It's almost an embarrassment now.
Yes, I can imagine, but let's bring it up.
Okay.
It's a 250
Ferrari 250 GTO.
Yeah.
And it's a curious car because it's now incredibly valuable. And so, but I bought it, as most people do buy those sort of cars, because of a sort of passion. You have to go almost a bit crazy to sort of make that jump. And I did this 30-something years ago. Yeah. And of course, what's great about it is it's great fun to drive. It's a race car, but it's also a rally car and a road car. Does everything.
Ah, great.
And it makes me look like a sort of Warren Buffett of motoring, as a sort of investment advisor. But you couldn't do it as an investment, because everyone. I think they've just sold one recently. I don't know how much for, but there was a message. There's obviously a story going around at the moment.
Yeah.
About,
so your investment has just accrued some dividends. Yeah. And then you also took flying lessons.
Oh yeah. No. There's a sort of transition really once you get into cars and particularly motor racing, because I started racing, and that for me was always why I had the cars. I've never been interested in actually accumulating a lot of cars. I just started racing, and every time there was another car to race, I'd think, well, I'll keep the other one, because then I could, run 3 cars at an event or whatever. And then moved into flying, partly because I'd got nervous of flying when we were touring, I think. And it's quite catching. So by the end of it, we were all terrified of flying, and we were all starting to go, well, maybe we should rent a car and drive. It's only 7 hours, which is insane. And I was talking to a friend of mine about this, and he said, well, what you need to do is learn to fly. And it was the most expensive therapy I've ever encountered. But I love it now. And
you've gone on to not only be a fixed-wing pilot, but also a
helicopters. Yeah, I love helicopters.
Yeah.
No.
This is an interesting thing about the English rock stars, because a lot of you have gone on and done this.
Yeah.
I understand. Is it the lead singer from Iron Maiden flies jets,
yes,
right? And then
yes,
Jeff, I know, has a huge collection. Well, not
JK
huge, of Model A's is his passion, and then he's taken flying lessons as well. And it's an interesting thing. When I went to Jeff's wedding, somebody arrived via helicopter, on his land. I mean, it's a very romantic and beautiful thing, and something we all aspired towards here in America.
It's romantic and beautiful, but actually, it's very technical. And I think there's a sort of, if you're interested in the tech side of it, and you end up getting deeper and deeper into it. And of course, along with the flying goes a lot of other stuff. So weather appraisal, which is really critical. And so you end up getting fascinated with that and how the systems operate, and watching the weather and learning to try and sort of work it out for yourself. But well, just to move on with that, because constantly the question is something about, how do the two work together, and are there similarities or whatever? And the interesting thing about it for me, I think, is that they complement each other. It's not that they're similar, but in one case, I think for a drummer, there's something great about having one activity where you're entirely on your own. It's based on you in the car, that's it. Whereas so much of the music life is you cannot do it on your own. There's a very limited number of people who want to watch Dark Side of the Moon played on the drums and nothing else.
Yeah.
It's a limited appeal. And so you're absolutely reliant on the others to make it work. And I think perhaps that's part of the reason why the two work together for me.
Yeah. When you tour, do you actually fly the band?
No. I'm opposed to trying to do the two multitask in that respect. I tend never to race during the period of a tour. Because I think I don't know what your experience is like, but I always find with touring that to some extent you really need to spend quite a lot of time within the tour for it to work and to be comfortable with it. And although you can get on top of each other some of the time, there's something really quite important about feeling that you are there, ready to go there, and quite a lot of the changes that get made are made sort of outside the working period, if you like. It's more difficult generally to invent the music and design it than it is to play it, particularly once you've rehearsed it up and you've been rolling for a while. But on the other hand, there's something really nice about developing it during a tour. And I think you can make things a lot better over a period, particularly if you're doing these really extended tours, and you're away maybe for a year or something like that. By the end of the tour, it should be on a good tour. It won't be better, but it'll be different. So that actually it has been changed.
Yeah, it evolves. To me, that's the thing I really miss about extended touring. I love the structure of it. I love being able to sleep, wake up at whatever, 2 or 3, and then have your coffee and go in there and tweak your drums and get everything all set, and then gear up for the mental thing of going out there and doing it. And trying to win the inner game, within yourself every night. How can I best, myself? And every time you do best yourself, if you don't quite come up to that watermark, then you're not satisfied in that. And then the hang after is always great. The humor and the release after a gig, and the traveling. I enjoy traveling on a bus. At first, I thought I could never sleep on a bus, but that's cool.
It's a very relaxing environment. People say, God, touring must be so hard. Well, the answer is it's as hard as you make it. If you want to go mad every night, then it's really hard. But
I like the focus of it, too, I'm not thinking about bills and all the other distractions.
How to mend something. And there's the learning element to it. The last couple of big tours, we've done it with 2 drummers, usually with Gary once. And there's something fantastic about working with another drummer, because there's so much that you can pick up all the way through. Yeah, the sheer magnitude of a Floyd show. I was lucky enough to work with Jeff Beck and on his retrospective, and he invited Roger to do a couple tunes that Jeff had played with Roger. And so, we rehearsed those, and he had like an Akai sampler with a click in our ears, and it also had like vocal cues for sections, and this was just so reassuring. It's like having a conductor say, okay, we're going to come up to this now, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there'd be like the first line of his lyrics, so that in case he blanked out. And this safety aspect, because you don't want to disappoint what you guys play for 80 to 100,000 people sometimes, right? So you have, tell us about the technical aspects of what goes into making a Floyd show so consistent. Well, it's interesting, actually, that you mentioned Roger's cue tracks, because actually the way Roger likes to do it and the way Dave likes to do it is rather different. And it's absolutely right that the clicks and the cues are really helpful when you do have to work with pyro or very specific film clips and so on. But I'm really quite. What I really like is to be able to almost mix the two. And for instance, we might well use a click for the beginning of a song, and then at some point drop it, and then it's free. And then if it actually wants to go for some extra choruses, then that's what happens. And that's for me perhaps the perfect mix, because certainly if you, as I say, if you've got film running or something like that. And film tends to be the thing that requires the most precision in that respect. Then you absolutely need the click. And certainly I know Roger with the wall show he's doing at the moment, where there's so much brilliant projection going on. It absolutely needs that countdown and so on. Yeah.
And do you find that, I mean, I suppose the ultimate freedom would be to not have a click, but you can, at least stretch and you don't find yourself sort of saddled by the click, let's say.
No, I mean, I think, as I say, the ideal situation is one where, for instance, Money, where we're quite often using a tape loop to set the rhythm, you absolutely need to stay in that. And because of the way it actually sounds, they're not percussive enough for it to be an easy thing to follow. So you really want that as a click rather than as a sound. But there's a point at where it goes into fours where actually drop it.
And have some fun. And you do have, I mean, some wonderful musicians. I mean, David's a wonderful guitarist. He's really got a wonderful sound and sonic personality and great, brilliant feel. Roger is I don't know, I mean, well, all you guys, you create wonderful, surrealistic atmospheres. You have the sense of spectacle, but yet it's never over the top. It's not cliche like Kiss or, some other big bands that do, let's say, theatrical stuff. Your stuff is theatrical in like a classic, more or less Broadway way, where it seems to be meaningfully absurd,
On a good day, the theory is that all the staging simply enhances the music and brings more concentration onto the music. That was the raison d'etre for it originally. And occasionally it gets a bit out of hand, I'd concede. But that's, the idea, the idea partly is when you're working with big audiences is to get their attention, because the biggest problem, I think, with these stadium shows is making sure that if they are at the back, they're still, you can get their attention, because there's nothing worse than that feeling that, half the audience are watching you and the other half are playing frisbee. It's not so good.
I wouldn't think so at a Floyd show, but I think, I don't know, man. It's got a lot of credibility. The sounds, sound effects, phones ringing, children's voices, all these things are really evocative and, have a depth to what they make you think and feel. That is a surrealistic experience that I like, And yet you guys have been doing this for so long, and now we have samplers that can make an entire song, bits and pieces of noise all strung together.
I think the interesting thing about playing is that you can do all these things with samples or whatever, but what I've found is that whole business of, I've really only worked with two bass players in my entire working career, really. And Roger's one and Guy Pratt the other. And that familiarity that comes with working with the same people. And it is quite extraordinary. And having, done two big tours with Guy and then coming back to do some shows with Roger, that thing where you go, oh yeah, no, of course, this is what's going to happen now. And they're very different players in sort of style and what they'll do. But how easily you sort of fall back into this pattern, or these patterns that one particular player makes.
Well, to me, it's we were talking earlier about synchronicity and things happening that out of time, that when you put them together in time seem like they happened at a single moment. And it seems like there's an order to the universe, and you were the guy meant for this whole scenario. So it's really a pleasure to get to sit down and talk to you about this stuff.
And a pleasure to talk with you.
And on that note, we will stop and be right back with more Nick Mason. have some questions. We asked our fans to tweet in some questions if they wanted to ask Nick. So one was, did you take formal lessons? And you told me earlier that you didn't. So,
Yeah.
And you just said to me, though, that you would like to take some drum lessons.
Yeah, I think I would really. I think I'm just really nervous about the idea of it. But I didn't take formal lessons, and I think that is certainly a regret, because I think it would have given me a lot more confidence for playing anyway. And I would certainly recommend anyone who is starting to take lessons rather than try and invent it themselves. I mean, I think there were probably a couple of good things that came out of it. And in an era, again, talking about Ginger, Mitch and so on, where the drummers played an awful lot, fairly full parts to the music, it probably restrained me a bit. Yeah. And for my particular band, that worked quite well.
Yeah, space. I mean, that's another aspect of music and rock and roll, having space. Not loud and fast or loud and busy at all times.
I think there's two things actually. I think one is absolutely space, and the other is dynamics. Because the problem with rock music is quite a lot of it is full on, flat out the whole time. Yeah. And actually, if you can build some dynamics into the music, it helps enormously. And it's one of those things that perhaps that's one of the most difficult things to learn, because the feeling is that always you've got to try and fill any space that you're given, rather than leave it.
Do you feel this sort of anxiety or, when you stage fright to this day? When you go out, or do you feel fairly confident? Or
I think fairly confident, but I think that is partly because that's one of the great advantages of being in a band, that actually you sort of know that you're with a team and that you can rely on them, and that actually even if you screw up, you're probably going to be able to recover it. And there is always that thing about if you make a mistake, the big thing is to then look really angrily at one of the others.
And I have felt this, especially in contrast to playing solo drums, which is probably the hardest thing you want to do. The next step was playing with an orchestra, because of the dynamic difference between I can click my sticks louder than a violin, and you really have to be careful to play powerfully, but not at a high dynamic. That was very challenging to keep a whole 60-piece orchestra together. But then when I go back from playing these kinds of things to being supported in a band, it just feels so good.
Yeah,
I just
it's so
envy
easier.
you for that. Because,
Interesting you talk about the orchestra. I absolutely agree. Fantastically difficult to work when you've got acoustic instruments and make it sound right. Because either it's sort of too light almost. I mean, it's one of those interesting things where sort of alternatives to sticks can sometimes work. Those, black sticks and things like that. Yeah. And also working with a conductor, because I don't know if you find that, but it took me a long time to work out where they really meant the beat to fall, because it's sort of not it's like that. Yeah. It's done in a rather different way.
Yeah, some of them are impossible to interpret, and that I think is.
Mind you, I do remember someone talking. I think the player in the New York. I can't remember which orchestra it was, and probably a good thing not to remember, but we were talking about conductors, and he said to me, well, we have a saying, he said, you look up, you fuck up.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a testament to how great the players are, how they're listening so well, and they don't let this mad waving of arms interfere with their sense of time,
I think we've just alienated a whole raft of conductors out there.
Nah, I mean, the best I've been with are very precise. Stravinsky was really precise. I'd never played with him, of course, but, the guy I had, Dick Bacher, was a film score guy with a click track, and man, you knew, he was excellent for
But you were playing Stravinsky music?
No, I was playing some stuff I composed, but, I think there are some really great conductors, and they have really good time. You can tell the way, and they're very clear. And they also managed to put on this show that's, sort of an evocative response to the music, like a dancer in a lot of respects. I think Ozawa was really good at that. And his sound, Bernstein, some other guys, boy, I don't know what the hell they're doing, and I really don't want to know, And the music, is back from, 2 centuries ago, so it's not really the kind of music I'm interested in.
I have to, this is a complete red herring, but just while the mention of Stravinsky, I think that for me, there are a couple of people who are not actually drummers, but probably just brilliant percussion writers or players. One is Thelonious Monk and the other is Igor Stravinsky. And in Stravinsky's case, I would recommend the book of his letters to anyone who's interested in music and wants to be entertained. He's an incredibly witty character.
He has so much great stuff. The poetics of music, I think, and his conversations with Robert Kraft, great reading. Just really a great mind and funny and,
And the beginning of The Rite of Spring.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, so much incredible stuff that he's done. And he lived such a long, wonderful life. Towards the end, he was actually talking about Cynthia Plastercaster and Zappa escapades, things like this, before he died, and which is, he was a modernist. Okay, we got a question here that was tweeted. What is your favorite part to play live, and what part of, say, your history on record would you like to re-record?
Okay, number one, probably one of my favorites is Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, which it's played with mallets, which makes it fun anyway and different and so on. It's entirely really down to Chico Hamilton. Do you remember the film Jazz in a Summer's Day?
Oh, yeah.
And Chico plays this really lovely solo with mallets. Yeah. And that was, again, one of those moments where you see something and you think, I'd like to do that. Yeah. And that whole sort of thinking on that piece is based on that. And it's got, again, it's a lovely piece from the point of view of dynamics, that it builds to something and then it, and then absolutely falls back down again and so on. So that would be a good one for that. What would I like to revisit? I suppose, funnily enough, I think, although it seems to work perfectly well, the intro to Time played on rototoms, because we just took, the second or third take, as far as I remember. When I listen back to it, I think, well, it could have been, constructed a bit better if I'd actually thought about it for longer and had more time and so on. But I think you tend to, I don't know about you, but I tend to listen to almost everything I've ever done a bit critically. I very rarely put anything on for pleasure, thinking I'd like to hear something I've done. It's when you have to listen to it or by chance listen to it. The tendency is always to think, could have done that differently. Yeah. I'm going through a period of that now, too. I'm listening to some old stuff to relearn, and there's definitely some tempo issues I don't want to push. I think they could be really, you could take your time with and not be. But then, at this point, I was very influenced by Billy Cobham and guys who played fast and hard, and, that kind of thing. Do you still play ukulele? Well, I was given a ukulele for Christmas a year ago, and I haven't got very far with it. Funnily enough, I was talking to a friend of mine, Ed O'Brien, a guitar player in Radiohead, who has a sort of ukulele meeting now and again, and I thought I might join in with that, but unfortunately they're about to go on tour. So, but I am intending eventually to make good that lack of proper tuition with drums and get some lessons. Well, you're always welcome here. I always try and say because there's this intuitive aspect and a feel aspect of playing that have yielded really great drummers, and then guys who have some luck or some fate or whatever you want to call it that enabled them to make a living. But the rest of us aren't maybe as lucky as Ringo or you or Charlie Watts, and so we have to practice. We have to learn to read and be able to play whatever some geezer throws at us, whether we like it or not. And but I will say that
just learning some simple things like the rudiments and things like how to read basic stuff. You don't have to be the greatest sight reader, but it gives you this sort of grid format to divide things and see things, to put over what we hear as nebulous music and as more of an emotional experience, so that we can count and measure and figure out things and analyze it better. And that has helped me. So you're always welcome here. We have great stuff on Drum Channel. I'm sure Don will give you a free subscription, and you can check out some of those things. Let's see. Which tour did you enjoy most, if any?
I think there is no single tour that I enjoyed most, because actually what I've really done, I've enjoyed playing live all my life, and consequently I've enjoyed every sort of area of it. And of course, the last time we were touring, it was the private jet and the limo to and from and all the rest of it. But actually, I enjoyed touring with 4 of us in the van and a couple of road crew and driving up and down the motorway, which we've talked about early on. Yeah. So I think, without wishing to sound too sort of romantic about it, I know that I'm really privileged to have toured at all in any of those sort of capacities. Yeah. And so I'm as grateful for the Ford Transit as I am for the jet.
Yeah, yeah. I do both, and I love both. I like driving now. I have a little SUV with a trailer, and I can pull my rig around, and if I go out with a tech, it's great. We do that in Europe with the quartet, and it's I like the dreaming aspect of traveling and kind of not thinking or just letting the mind go, and then I like being able to perform every night. It's just that's what you're doing all of it for. And when times are tough, I tell myself, well, that's the part they're paying me for, because I certainly do the playing part for free, And I've had the jet situation, or not jet, but we had a private plane, prop plane, turboprop, and it was wonderful to sleep in, limo to the plane and thing, with
know
Zappa.
That the plane isn't going to go until you're there.
It's just so lovely, And it's sort of it's necessary in certain times for certain situations, but I can go either way. It's just a privilege to get to play.
It's a means to an end.
It is.
And the end is being on stage playing.
Yeah,
so whatever
absolutely.
It takes.
Yeah. Okay, how do you prefer your drums tuned? Is there a specific melodic approach to your drumming?
No, there isn't. I mean, I tune them just really by ear until they sound right. I mean, in fact, that tends to be sort of fifths, usually, apart. But you tend to sort of set them up, and then thinking mainly, either live or studio, what you tend to do is just see how they sound with the band. Yeah. But I'm not specific to, EA or whatever, specific notes. It's much more... the sound between the drums.
Now, are you the kind of drummer who just lets your tech handle all these things, or are you a mad closet tweaker like I am?
I'm somewhere between the two. Yeah. I've got a great tech with Clive Brooks, and certainly when we're touring, particularly if there are occasionally situations where you can't even do a proper sound check, I absolutely rely on Clive to do a really good job. But there are inevitably situations where you don't have a drum tech. I mean, I quite like that thing of... I'd done a few bits of recording particularly for charity records and things like that, where I did one with Bill Wyman a year ago, where I'll just take the drum kit and turn up myself and set it up. And so there isn't anyone else to do it. And I really enjoy it. And certainly if I'm at home, I'll fiddle with the tuning and so on. I'm quite interested in whether there's any technology to do that, i.e. using tuning strobes and using, I think it's called a drum tuner, something that measures the pressure. I just find them too clunky. I mean, it takes too long.
Yeah,
actually.
They measure the tension of the head. But
it's a really interesting idea, but it just, by the time you've sort of worked around
Yeah.
the edge of the drum.
It doesn't really have that ultimately much to do with the tuning
Yeah.
or the way pitch-wise, and
Yeah.
then the richness of the tone. It's a weird thing, somewhere between an art and a science. I've looked on physics sites about the aspects of it, but I mean, so far I'll get a note from a glockenspiel and tune to that, and you know, I know how I want my drum to sound, and I find that just a little bit more tension on the bottom head than the top, but pretty much the same is about what I need. The other way, and it starts to bend down like the old Ringo modulation, if you want to go that way. And for every drum, like bass drums tune differently than snare drums, which tune differently than tom-toms, and so whatever it takes, you know, to get what you want.
That's right. It's almost more important to get that sort of matching tone than it is the matching note, because what you want is that dum 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 rather than one thing that's ringing well beyond the others and so on.
Yeah.
By the time once you're sort of setting the kit up, it's in some ways it's much more important to have that. You know, things like that something doesn't set the snare off and get that rattling and so on.
Right.
So it's more intuitive, I think, than aiming for notes.
Can you remember playing and then suddenly there was mics on your drums before there was, you know, the mics were just not put on drums?
Yeah, it was a change.
Yeah.
But it sort of came partly from the studios, I suppose, that whole business.
Yeah, but I'm sure probably in the early days you had more of an ambient miking. I don't think in the
studio or live?
In the studio,
you
probably didn't tend to mic each instrument.
No, they didn't. There was more of a sort of
overall.
D19 for the bass drum and maybe a Shaw for the snare, and then maybe U87s over the top, that sort of thing.
And so in that respect, I find I want my drums to be more like a coherent instrument, not separate. And the more you turn the control of miking each individual drum and putting it out there to a mixer, unless you have a really good mixer and you've discussed, you know, you want everything even like your ear hears it, let's say, you know, then you kind of can find yourself in these situations where just depending on the EQ or the position of the mic, this drum's going to stick out like a sore thumb and the other's kind of...
No, I have to say that it's the ultimate test of the engineer, really, is setting the drums up, because the good engineer can make them sound wonderful, and the poor engineer can just, you can spend days on it.
Yeah. This question is, what was your favorite album to record, and which song was your favorite?
I don't think I've really got I mean, some albums were easier than others, some tracks easier than others. What were sort of the moments? You know, something like Piper, which was the first album, was really exciting because we were in the studio for the first time. We had the Beatles down the hall recording Sgt. Pepper. It was all a bit magic, but we had less control, so that was sort of less interesting. I prefer, at the end of the day, playing live is the ultimate treat, but working in the studio is still, again, it's one of those great ways of spending time. And they were just very different. So the experience was so different. That's the thing. It's no good saying, well, I liked Piper best, because Piper was recorded with... We'd record the backing tracks, Roger and myself playing together, Dave and Rick putting something down so that to follow. But then I really enjoyed it when we started getting really technical with the wall and had Bob Ezrin on board, and Bob and I were working on drum tracks for that. And it became much more focused. You know, the others were somewhere else putting guitars down or vocals or whatever. But it was just a very different experience, but as much fun or as interesting.
It sort of becomes like an electronic art form and a constructionist, activity, as opposed to the live performance art form. You know.
Yeah, yeah.
How about, given all the complex staging and production, what is the craziest thing that's happened on stage? Like inflatable pigs crashing into your kit, perhaps, or?
Not many big disasters. I mean, we had the Cobo Hall explosion where we'd got a stage weight in a bin, and there was a firework. You know, there was meant to be a puff of smoke and flame, and the stage weight had an air bubble in it, so it superheated and fractured.
Oh, man.
Exploded with a bang that actually knocked out virtually every speaker we had.
Wow.
So that was a bit dramatic.
Was there shrapnel and injuries involved?
Absolutely. There was one guy who was in the front row who took a bit of shrapnel, but he was there for the second half. So it was a night to remember.
Yeah.
And the other big one was we designed an inflatable pyramid. And the idea was that we had a stage with the pyramid sitting on top, so it worked as a roof as well. And it was tested up to winds of 20 miles an hour. And of course, the night that we sort of rigged it, there was 25 knots of wind, and it escaped.
Oh, man.
And it had been such a problem. I mean, it needed to be filled with helium every night, and we had these trucks with huge cylinders of gas and so on. And we actually... Someone just thought, we've had enough of this, and cut it free.
Yeah.
And so this thing went up in the air. The crowd thought it was absolutely fantastic. And I remember what happened, because it's not a good flying shape, the pyramid. And so it inverted, and it had a section inside in the tip that had to keep it, in theory, to keep it in the right shape. And it inverted, so this other thing floated out of it. I remember someone in the crowd screaming, "My God, it's giving birth!" After which it crashed into the car park, and everyone cut bits out of it to take it home. So that was that. That was probably about the most dramatic.
Well, that's a good one, I must say. Let's see. When will you have a world tour again? And will you select a female percussionist? This time?
Yeah, that sounds obviously someone who's been watching Prince. No plans, sadly. I mean, I'm very happy. I'd be really happy to head out again, but Roger's busy doing the wall anyway, so, and I don't think David wants to tour at the moment, so I can't see it at the moment at all.
Now, does that aspect frustrate you? I mean,
yeah, because as I said earlier, the problem is that if you're a drummer, you just do need the others to make it work. But on the other hand, there's no point in doing it unless everyone wanted to do it.
Yeah.
And at this stage, the prospect of starting a new band is sort of beyond me. I think I'd rather...
yeah, that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
Especially, I think, when I don't know, when you're kind of married to people like this, it's difficult. And
you sort of end up wanting either to do it properly or not do it, and not really sort of falling somewhere else in the middle of that. Yeah. So, no plans. And female percussion player, I mean, they're brilliant.
But
so many of them.
You've had Gary for many years, right?
Yeah, and Gary in a dress is not a good thought.
Sorry?
Gary in a dress is not a good thought.
God, heaven forbid.
But there was Jodie, who played with David, who's terrific. And as I say, all those Sheila E. and people like that, fantastic. Yeah. But I think one would probably stick with the people you've worked with before.
Yeah, tried and true. It's kind of overwhelming to talk to you. There's so much to you as a person, outside of this thing called Floyd, and then the thing called Floyd is so humongous. And for me personally, I'm a bit of a snob and a jaded guy, and I don't, like a lot of music that I hear. A lot of music that I grew up with has aged really well. Others has not. Other pieces have not. So. I can actually say, I've only seen you guys one time, and that was at the LA Sports Arena in the 80s, I guess.
Yeah.
A friend of mine took me, and I really loved it. And, I've loved the music and envied, I think so many of us, have envied the aspect of what Pink Floyd can do, just that magic. And we all wish we could do that. And we all take from you some of these special things that you guys have innovated. And then, the other part of your life is so phenomenally interesting, too. I mean, to become a pilot, to become a race car driver, just to do all the things that you've done, to be a cook. And you've raised a few kids. You've had...
done that as well,
many rich life experiences. So I'm you know, I'm really just have a great affinity for you and a sense of joy and gratitude for being able to sit here and talk with you and for my, you know, freak situation where I got to eat at your house that night.
Well, it's an honor to sit here with you. So thank you.
Well, what can I say? The one, the only Nick Mason, thank you so much.
Thank you.